unable to log in the meantime. So, as part of our syllabus, today we are going to discuss about in this contemporary international relations. We are going to discuss about our new topics in our chapter. One is international terrorism, and also we have a syllabus about uh, this human rights and ethnicity issue. So, just a second. So, in this concept, we are going to discuss about the historical background of evolution of the human rights, and also what are the classifications are there in the uh, human rights, and what is the basic features of human rights, and also what is the role of international institutions such as United Nations organization and other governments in the all the other nations, countries, and governments in several states. So even after the declaration of United Nations Declaration on Human Rights in 1948, many nations adopted these type of human rights as a basic concept for the audio. Just a second. Is it okay now?
నో సార్, కొంచెం తక్కువగానే ఉంది సార్.
Okay. So, in this context, we are going to discuss about the evolution of the this concept. So, human rights is a basic concept for human beings for better life. So, even after the Second World War, and also at the time of both world wars, the crisis of these human rights has raised by many developed nations and allied nations due to many victims are became after these two world wars. Even before the end of the Second World War, the Allied powers expressed the hope that after every victorious nation has to protect the human rights of individuals, even though they are in victorious state or other state. So the at the time of Dumbarton Oaks Conference in 1944, the emphasis was laid on the promotion of human rights and fundamental freedom. So, at the time, many representatives across the world gathered at the San Francisco conference, demanded that the Declaration of Human Rights should be included in the United Nations Charter. So, before making this United Nations Charter, in the preamble of United Nations Charter declared that one of the chief aims of the organization is to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of the nations large and small. So Article 1 of the United Nations Charter, which is like our Constitution of India, United Nations Charter is um, is a unique and fundamental agenda for the maintenance of United Nations organization. So, in that United Nations Charter Article 1 says that principle about this purpose of United Nations is to achieve international cooperation in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all the citizens who are living in the world. So even Article 55 of United Nations Charter provides that the United Nations organization shall promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as race, sexuality, language, creed, and religion. Even Article 68 required the Economic and Social Council to set up commission in economic and social fields and for the promotion of human rights on the basis. So the council may make recommendations for the purpose of promoting respect for and observance of human rights. So after the establishment of United Nations organization, since the General Assembly of United Nations proclaimed its Universal Declaration of Human Rights on 10th December 1948. So at that time, the concept of these human rights has become mandatory for the entire nations across the world. So So after the declaration of this United Nations organization, the concept of human rights has been became a mandatory thing for every constitution of every nation across the world. So the United Nations declaration on this issue contains 30 articles, including the preamble. The preamble stresses the dignity and worth of the human of mankind. So it's an international Magna Carta. Magna Carta means at the time of 1215th year, the at the in the state of England, they made a declaration regarding the human rights for the first time in modern history. So this Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations Organization held in 1948 also it's an international Magna Carta for all men everywhere in the world. So the United Nations not only made a declaration of human rights, but also took steps to ensure that they are effectively implemented by the states. With this view, the General Assembly in 1951 requested the Commission on Human Rights to prepare drafts for two covenants, one on civil and political rights and other economic, social and cultural rights. So this is the Universal Declaration and the two covenants together known as International Bill of Rights constitute the core of international human rights law. So by the year 2010, each covenant had been ratified by more than 80% of the 194 nations in the United Nations organization. So then the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women in 1979. So the Convention Against Torture in 1984 and the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989. Working Group on Arbitrary Detention was set up in 1991. Even though special procedures have been introduced for human rights and extreme poverty in 1998, and structural adjustment and foreign debt in 2000, and for the right to education 1998, food, housing in 2000, and health 2002. So the end of the Cold War, which means in 1991 to 91 and 92, after the disintegration of Soviet Union, was brought some immediate human rights improvements. So the new world order produced complex human rights patterns. So both the General Assembly and the Commission on Human Rights became more active. So UN's positive outcome can be seen in the field of human rights. So if we see, there are several international agencies also there to protect and to maintain these UN Charter principles by the nations across the world. Many non-governmental organizations also working on the protection of these human rights issue. So if we see the United Nations mechanism for human rights, the promotion and the protection of human rights has been a major activity for the United Nations organization since its establishment. So United Nations has developed a wide network for human rights instruments and mechanisms to ensure the protection of human rights. So the General Assembly of United Nations is the main deliberative body of the United Nations. So uh, the Economic and Social Council, also one of its organ, is established for following protection of these human rights. Like there are several commissions, councils also there. Like Human Rights Council is there. Commission for Status of Women is there. Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice also there. So this Human Rights Council is the main policy making body dealing with human rights issues. It is established in 2006. It replaced the former United Nations Commission on Human Rights. So these institutions are especially made for the protection of human rights. So there are several strategies also there by the United Nations to enhance the respect for fundamental human rights and to further progress towards their realization. The United Nations adopted three-pronged approach. One is establishment of international standards, second one is protection of human rights, and last one is United Nations technical assistance. So here the international human rights standards were developed to protect people's human rights against violations by individuals, groups, or nations. So the Declaration of United Nations of these human rights, the Declaration on the Right to Development, also made in 1986, and the Declaration on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance 1992 are some international human rights standards. So many countries have incorporated the provisions of these declarations into their laws and conditions. So if we see in our Indian Constitution also, we have borrowed the fundamental rights from the United States of America and placed in our Constitution in the Part 3 from the Article 12 to 35. So all these fundamental rights are for the purpose of protection and maintenance of equality, freedom, liberty, equality, and fraternity. So these are the uh, important concept for the these related to human rights. So if we see the origin of this concept also made by the natural law. So even before this modern state system also, there is no issue about this human rights concept. So after the establishment of modern state system only, the concept of these human rights has been raised by modern thinkers. So they guided the people to achieve, to gain their rights from the rulers. So the principle of equality, principle of liberty, principle of fraternity also got from their rulers. So in the evolution of human rights, this concept of natural law played a prominent role. So many modern thinkers like Cicero and others developed this body of rules on the basis of customs and by the application of reason. So the concept of human rights was conspicuous on ancient Greece and even in India. So ancient kings in India cared for the welfare of the people. So the rights of the people is mainly recognized and protected by moral and spiritual dictated, and the whole thing got derived from natural law, which was the ruling law. So in the evolution of human rights, the modern school of natural law led by Hugo Grotius made great contributions on this concept. So he made natural law, and that natural law theory got transformed into the natural rights theory. So many theories also are developed by many thinkers. So like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, John Jacques Rousseau are the three main thinkers who developed the natural rights theory. So John Locke, who argued that certain rights are natural to individuals as human beings, having existed even in the state of nature before the development of the societies and the emergence of the state. Even Rousseau is also regarded as the greatest master of natural law school. So he proclaimed that men are bestowed with inalienable rights of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So even his concepts become the basis for the French Revolution and French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. So even their motto of French Revolution is liberty, equality, fraternity. Even in American independence movement of 1776 also, and the French Revolution of 1789 also were inspired by the ideal of individual rights, and both movements were sought to challenge governments that curtailed the natural rights of the people. So, in addition, these contributions of above these three thinkers, we may make a mention of Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, a American revolutionary thinker, developed the doctrine of natural rights without linking it to Rousseau's social contract theory. So, if we see the development of human rights concept, the first basic agreement, which is we called it as Magna Carta of 1215, and later these three thinkers, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, made social contract theories, and later in 1689 the English Bill of Rights also one of the origin for this human rights concept. So later American Declaration of Independence of 1776, American Bill of Rights in 1791, French Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789, the Bolshevik Revolution of Russia, which is happened in 1917, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So later international governance on human rights and many modern states has been introduced this concept in their constitutions. So each of these declaration and the movement referred these made important contributions in advancing the concept of human rights. So this Magna Carta and the social contract theories are very influenced these concept to modern thinkers. So even United Nations bill also this declaration and Bill of Rights 1791, United States, and also French Revolution, Bolshevik Revolution, also best examples for this concept. So if we see the classification of our concept, there are six-fold classification of rights is there. So one is security rights that protect people against murder, torture, and genocide. The second one is due process rights that protect people against arbitrary and excessively harsh punishments and require fair and public trials for those accused of crimes. And the third one is liberty rights that protects people fundamental freedoms in areas such as belief, expression, association, and movement, and political rights that protect people's liberty to participate in politics by assembling, protesting, voting, serving in the public office. And fifth one is equality rights that guarantee equal citizenship, equality before the law, and the freedom from discrimination. And Last one is social rights that require that governments ensure to all the availability of work, education, health services, and adequate standard of living. So, for better understanding, the human rights in the area of civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, and collective rights are the major areas of these human rights. So, if we see the basic features of human rights, human rights are uh, inherent to all human beings, whatever our nationality, our place of residence, our gender, sex, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. All the human beings are equally entitled to human rights without discrimination. So these rights are all interrelated and interdependent and indivisible. So these are often expressed and guaranteed by the law in forms of treaties, customary international law, general principles, and other sources of international law. So, as we mentioned in our Constitution of India, we have strictly implementing these human rights and fundamental rights by the court of law. So, if anyone by personal or any organization or any government or any institution, if violates the fundamental rights, we may approach to the higher courts like Supreme Court and High Court. We may get protection from the courts in this regarding fundamental rights. So the human rights also lays down obligations of governments to act in certain ways or to refrain from certain acts in order to promote and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms of individuals and groups. If we see, there are five types of writs there in Article 32 of Indian Constitution. If anyone violate our fundamental rights, we can approach these two courts. So if state level High Court, at union level Supreme Court, so they will impose these writs on the several issues. So if to protect our human rights. So the Article 32 is the main. So many thinkers have uh, claimed that the heart or soul of the Constitution. So these human rights are inalienable. They should not be taken away except in specific situations and according to due process. So human rights are universal. So the principle of universality of human rights is the cornerstone of international human rights law. So as we discussed, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 has been reiterated in numerous international human rights conventions, declarations, and resolutions. So all the human rights are indivisible and interrelated and interdependent, whether they are civil and political rights. So, like the right to life, equality before the law, and freedom of expression, economic and social cultural rights, the right to work, social security, and right to education, and our collective rights like the rights to development and self-determination. So the improvement of one right facilitates advancement of the others. So the state's obligation to protect human rights, the states assume obligations and duties under international law to respect, to protect, and to fulfill human rights. So the states must refrain from interfering with or curtailing the enjoyment of human rights. So the international human law lays down the obligations of governments to act in certain ways or to refrain from certain acts. So the Human Rights Council, established in 15th March of 2006 by General Assembly, is made up of 47 state representatives, is tasked with strengthening the promotion and protection of human rights around by the globe by addressing situations of human right violations and making recommendations on them, including responding to human rights emergencies. So the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights is the focal point for human rights activities at international level. So it serves as the Secretariat for the Human Rights Council, the treaty bodies, and other United Nations human rights organs. So the principle of non-discrimination is the central theme of this concept, human rights. So non-discrimination is a cross-cutting principle in international human rights law. So the state should follow this principle. This principle of non-discrimination is present in all the major human rights treaties and provides the central theme of some of international human rights conventions, such as the International Convention on Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination and the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. If we see, there is race discrimination we may observe in United States, like black and white, even in South Africa. If we see in India, there is caste, religion, and gender discrimination also we can see in recent times. So this concept in these several issues, there are many violent incidents also happened by this concept of human rights. So the United Nations suggests and directs the state governments. State governments means all the member states in United Nations organizations to promote and to protect the this human rights concept. So many countries in their constitutions also introduced this concept as mandatory for the better implementation of human rights. So many international conferences, many international summits also uh, uh, maintained by the United Nations and several international institutions for the purpose of the protection of international human rights concept. So if we see, there are several non-governmental organizations also there for the protection of international human rights concept. So like Human Rights Watch and many international human rights organizations also there. So even if we see in our Constitution of India, if we see in Administration of India, we have established National Human Rights Commission for the protection of Human Rights Commission. So the Constitution of India made an act for the protection of human rights in 1993, demands for the constitution of National Human Rights Commission and State Human Rights Commission and the human rights courts. So a national human rights institution can be described as an independent organization that is established by the government according to specific legislation with an aim to promote and protect human rights at a national level. So we have National Human Rights Commission. So it was the first such commission constituted in the South Asian region. So if we see the structure of the National Human Rights Commission, the Protection of Human Rights Act provides the NHRC consists of 5 members, including the chairman. So the a chairperson who has been a Chief Justice of Supreme Court, one member from has been a judge of the Supreme Court, and another member who is or has been the Chief Justice of High Court. 2 members to be appointed from among persons having knowledge or practical experience in matters relating to the human rights. So the chairpersons of National Commission for Minorities, National Commission for Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribes, the National Commission for Women shall be deemed to be the members of the commission for the discharge of certain functions. So the functions of this NHRC is the inquiry and investigation complaints of human rights violations, their abatement or the negligence in the prevention of such violations by public servant. And NHRC has been vested with the powers similar to those available to a civil court while trying a suit. So this means the commission can summon and enforces courts and the attendees of any person, examine under oath, require documents and items to be produced before the commission. So the NHRC can undertake inspections, make recommendations and living conditions in jail and other institutions. So it may also monitor existing legal and constitutional mechanism for protecting human rights. So even intervention in court proceedings also made by this NHRC may intervene with the court's permission in proceedings involving human rights violation. For example, the NHRC has effectively intervened in a case of gross violation of human rights in the Best Bakery case, in which serious questions were raised about the fairness of the criminal justice system. And also, the NHRC is mandated to sensitize the government to its constitutional obligations to accede and honor international human rights treaties. So the NHRC also entrusted with spreading human rights literacy and awareness and encouraging the efforts of non-governmental organizations and institutions working in the field of human rights. So even even this commission required to submit an annual report to the central as well as state governments concerned. It can also submit special reports on any matter of urgency or important. So the Protection of Human Rights Act 1993 also provides for the establishment of State Human Rights Commission to be constituted by the respective state governments. So it will also act like National Human Rights Commission at the union level. The state Human Rights Commission will be acts like in state level. So Indian judiciary also able to protect the human rights and prevents the executive and legislative branches from violating their area of jurisdiction because of several features of Indian constitution, like separation of powers, written constitution, rule of law, integrity and freedom of judiciary, um, social representation, training and educational background of judges, judicial activism, writ petition, public interest litigations also remarkable in this protect. Even though role of media also important in protecting human rights. So all the media, which including the print, electronic and the new media, which means social media, in one way or another way protecting and promoting human rights. So the media not only carriers of information but also as interpreters, supporters and advocates on of certain social, political and cultural values. So journalism as a profession is for social service. So now the new media and the social network help a lot for the anti-corruption campaigns and for protecting the human rights. So its potential is very high and it can influence lakhs of people with minimum time. So it also gives more support to overthrow the bad government and for the liberation of the people in various countries. So the media promoted human rights by making people aware of their rights and duties. So, however, uh, one thing we should bear in mind that the media in the globalized corporate world, while thinking about make more profit deliberately or not, dismantling human rights issues. So they try to protect the corporates and the advertisers. So it reports only the news item which will add its profits by increasing circulation or rating like TRPs. So sometimes it uses human right violation issues to make sensational stories too. An independent and impartial media can only work for the protection and promotion of human rights. So many international institutions and non-governmental organizations also working for the protection of human rights, and also they are making human rights movements for the protection of human rights, like Amnesty International, also an international important international non-governmental organization working in the area of human rights protection. So it was established in 1961. um, the Amnesty International is one of the important international non-governmental organization in this field. So these institution major areas concern as rights of women, children, minorities, and indigenous communities, torture, death penalty, refugees, human dignity, and prisoners' rights. So these areas are focused by this Amnesty International. So the organization uses different methods to attain these goals like demonstrations, vigils, direct lobbying, online as well as offline campaign techniques. So now it is working more than 150 countries across the world with a membership of more than 2.2 million. So the ultimate authority for the conduct of the affairs of the Amnesty International is the International Council. So the World Watch Institute is an international non-governmental organization which also working in the area of third generation human rights like right to environment and development. So this is also one of the best example for this human rights concept, which is in non-governmental sector. So many programs are organized by these non-governmental organizations, particularly in the areas of climate and energy, food and agriculture, environment and society. So even Asia Watch is also human rights watch, a division in Asian continent. So it's an international non-governmental organization dedicated to the protection and promotion of human rights concept. So there are People's Union for Civil Liberties also there, many civil liberties committees also there. Even in our states also many non-governmental and non-profitable institutions also working for the protection of human rights like civil liberties committee, other non-governmental organizations also working on this concept. So there are several challenges also there for the protection and maintenance of the human rights. One is terrorism. Terrorism also one of the major challenge for this human rights issue. So terrorism symbolizes pre-mediated violent activity to attain political objectives. So several causes are pertaining this specific issue. So the terrorism and its impact on human rights is highly complex. So through leads to severe human rights violation. Most of the terrorist claim human rights as their base, but terrorist activities cause human rights violation in two ways. One, it directly violates the rights of life, security, development, etc. Secondly, it compels the state to abridge from its commitment to the protection of human rights. So there is the concept of religious fundamentalism also, a religious movement characterized by a return to the fundamental principles on this concept. So there are several challenges also there for the protection of these maintenance of this human rights concept. So this is our syllabus in this particular topic. So we have one more concept, that is international terrorism. So if you see that terrorism is the use of violence often against civilian targets in instill fear, generate publicity also, and sometimes destabilize governments. Generally speaking, small groups fighting against powerful states practice terrorism. So in some cases during the world wars and after the world war, during the cold war, which means after the establishment of United Nations organization from 1945 to at the end of the cold war from up to 1991 and 92, the cold war between superpowers, which we called it as USA and USSR. So the both nations, especially United States, encouraged many terrorist organizations at other states to uh, to fight with the Soviet ideologies. So generally speaking, these small groups majorly funded by many developed nations like United States of America. So the terrorism, these concept, the terrorism has been used by Russian nationalists in Israel, Nazi forces, environmentalists in worldwide, left-wing guerrillas in Europe, discontented radicals in the United States, Latin American death squads, and Islamic fundamentalists are the example for these terrorist groups. So terrorism is not tied to any one particular ideology or group. So if we see the types of terrorism, scholars generally classify terrorism into two types. So terrorism practiced by governments and terrorism practiced by groups not affiliated with a government. So the ideological terrorism aims to promote a particular belief system, acts of violence. So it may be practiced by both governments and groups. So terrorist acts ultimately aim to undermine governments and disrupt societies. Many terrorists are young, frustrated men who feel they have been treated unjustly. Sometimes terrorists try to destabilize a government directly via assassinations, kidnappings, and the bombing of government buildings. So terrorists can also work to undermine governments indirectly by showing people that their leaders are too weak to prevent the attacks and that an active resistance movement exists. So sometimes terrorists attack in order to provoke a strong response from the government, hoping that the response will alienate more people from the government and foster even more political discord. So the international terrorism is the major problem for these even fundamental principles and human rights issues across the world. So even all the countries, including developed nations, also facing this international terrorist concept. So So, in recent times, modern terrorism can be traced back in 19th century revolutionary radicalism, and in particular, emergence of anarchist and collective anarchist and anarcho-communist groups. So, um, the technological developments in the mid and late 19th century also played a pivotal role in the rise of these terrorism. So the ready availability of dynamite allowed terrorists to perpetrate and disseminate their deadly acts more widely as propaganda by the dead. So the League of Nations and terrorism at the time of 1919 Versailles Peace Treaty between German and Allied powers that concluded World War One. At the time, also many radical groups are there. Later 20th century link between modern terrorism and the ideal of self-determination arose within the competing ideologies of communist or socialist theory. So the United Nations and terrorism also we see a recurring feature of discussions, debates, and political sensitivities regarding terrorism during the post 1945 United Nations era have related to issues of terror violence by so-called liberation fighters. So uh, according to David Rapport, an expert on terrorism, classified modern terrorism into the four waves. So, as we discussed, anarchist wave and new left wave and religious wave and anti-colonial wave. So, these are the modern terrorism activities. If we see the significance of terrorism in international politics, terrorism uses violence as a means. Every act of terrorism is fundamentally political nature. Non-state actor plays an important role in taking the techniques of terrorism. Each terrorist action targets certain specific audience, and the purpose is to communicate to a specific group or to the governments by the perpetrators. And terrorist targets that are not directly connected with the grievance highlighted by the terrorist generally. So, terrorism going global level in modern times, the development of terrorism into a genuinely transnational phenomenon is generally associated with the advance of globalization. So, further, religion, when mixed with unstable political orders and emotive mobilization processes, also lead to globalization terrorism, especially of jihad oriented terrorism and Islamic oriented terrorism. So, as we seen many terrorist attacks in recent times. So, globalization in one hand and politicization of religion on the other hand can be seen as two facets of global spread of terrorism. So, if we see the impact of globalization on terrorism, the globalization has generated pressures that have contributed to a growth in political militant generally. So, Islamist jihadist terrorism also important in recent times. It emerged from the late 1970s onwards because of three reasons. First one, growing number of Muslim states experienced crisis of governmental legitimacy, and people started venting their anger mounted against corrupt and autocratic regimes that were failed to meet their citizens. Second reason is US influence in the Middle East since UK's withdrawal from military bases. And third one is there was a growth in politically engaged forms of religious fundamentalism in many parts of Islamic world. So a trend that was radically accelerated by the 1979 Iranian or Islamic Revolution. So the emergence of globally networked terrorists is a new development in international affairs. The ability of these internationally networked terrorists to strike almost anywhere at any time negatively affected and challenged the monopoly of nation state to wage war in the international system. So, if we see the methods of terrorism, the terrorist groups has used some basic strategies of terrorism like compellence, provocation, polarization, and mobilization. So there are several tactics also there in this concept. So modern terrorism has sometimes been dubbed catastrophic terrorism because this terrorism more radical and devastating. So before invention of dynamite and automatic weapons, killings conducted by terrorists had to be done on one basis. So the introduction of new weapons and technology has enabled terrorists to kill efficiently in greatest numbers. So the bomb blast, the hostage taking, hijacking aircrafts, suicide squads are the examples for these terrorist activities. So So, if you see the terrorist groups and organizations in recent times, according to Global Terrorism Index 2018, compiled by the Institution for Economics and Peace of the 18,804 deaths caused by terrorists around the world last year. So, in 2017. So, there are several groups are there like ISIL or ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, and Al Qaeda, uh, Taliban, Boko Haram, Hezbollah, Al Shabaab, Lashkar-e-Toiba are the one of the best examples for the recent terrorist groups. So the terrorism poses particularly difficult challenge to establish societies. Unlike together military threats, terrorists often do not have a conventional base or location, and they may be particularly difficult to distinguish from the civilian population large. So the strengthening state security is important for the removal of these terrorist activities from the state. The military repression, force-based or repressive counter-terrorism has in recent years been particularly associated with war on terror or global war on terrorism. So the military responses on terrorism have been based on two complementary strategies, and also political deals. Political solutions can be found to terrorist problems. but political approaches are most likely to be effective in the case of nationalist terrorism. So the terrorism is loosely defined as an unlawful use of threatened use of violence against a civilian, often to achieve political, religious, and similar objectives. So there is difficulty in defining what terrorism is because terrorist for some becomes hero for the other. So the concept, the terrorism became a global problem with global interconnectivity of financial and technical nature. So thus, modern terrorism became global along the forces of globalization. The attack on USA in September 11, 2000 broke the immunity of terrorism to the powerful nation of the world. So this event rose the world attention to terrorism seriously. So international terrorism perceived as threat to world in many ways. There is need for more closer cooperation of the countries in the world to counter terrorism, which now has a global reach. So this is the concept of terrorism. So in tomorrow's class, we are going to discuss about weapons of mass destruction. So I am concluding the session. Thank you for your participation.